our 7th unit here. And so where we always want to start is looking at years. So unit 7 is going to take us from 1890 to 1940, right? Or 1945, excuse me. So if we look at 1890, so why 1890? So let's go back to our last unit where I showed you this map. Well, what does 1890 represent when you look at this map based on the census data of this time period? What did we say? Because we started our last unit with this, right? And we think.
Like the effective end of the American frontier.
Exactly, right? So really it's this idea that all of that vast land of the West is now pretty much gone, right? Or at least that free land. It's not like the land is gone, but it's been settled, right, by many white settlers to the West, right? And so remember, we started with this guy before, The Significance of the American Frontier by Frederick Jackson Turner, right? And why again did he say that having a frontier in our history was so important? What did he say it constantly did for us? Carson, what's it do? Exactly, right? It promotes individualism because people go out there and conquer it, right? All on their own. So in other words, if American values of individualism and democracy came out of this idea of a frontier, and Frederick Jackson Turner was talking about, well, now it's over, what's that say? So here's what he said at the end, which we never read. I didn't give it to you when we read it in our last unit. He says this: "And now 4 centuries from the discovery of America, at the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution, the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history." Well, why would he say that? So first off, what is he saying, and why would he say that? And we think.
He's basically saying the frontier is gone, like we developed our economically and politically and all of this, like we're getting more powerful and now we're moving into our next age.
Exactly, right? Now why would we? So why could we basically not be the same people we were before when we had all this vast land of the West? Now that it's gone, why can't we be the same? Oh, what do you think? Absolutely, right? So this idea that without all that free land, that so Frederick Jackson Turner was someone who believed in the safety valve theory. That because you always had land of the West, any sort of internal tension could always be released by moving people west, right? So remember when people were upset with the market revolution in the early 1800s, they moved west, right? When people were upset with kind of government controls, they moved west, right? When ethnic tensions in these cities started to burst, they moved west, right? When African Americans were upset with the Jim Crow South after Reconstruction, many of them moved west. So it's this idea that there was always a safety valve for these sorts of tensions within the United States. Well, what's the problem now? If you believe in that safety valve theory that Frederick Jackson Turner believed in, what's the problem by the time we get to the 1890s? Samuel, what do you think? Exactly, right? Because there's no more safety valve, right? That land of the West is not there, so now this increase of internal tension has now grown. So he's basically saying we can't be the same country we were prior to when we had all of that land. So that's why we start in 1890, the closing of the American frontier. 1890 is also the events at Wounded Knee, one of the worst massacres of Native Americans by the U.S. military, which is the kind of symbolic end to that fighting between the American military and Native Americans. So it really is kind of symbolized by the closing of the frontier. All right, well then why 1945? Carson, why? Absolutely, right? So that is the dropping of the atomic bombs over Japan and the end of World War II, which is where we will end this unit, right, in March. Absolutely, right? So this is a no-joke unit, right, is what we're looking at. All right, so let's kind of look at the major themes and the major questions we're going to have to answer, right, because they are numerous. So we look at this idea. So I've given you this statement by the College Board on your note sheet for today. And let's kind of break it down and understand. Because whenever you are about to embark on a unit of history where you're studying that is immense, right? We're going to study several major wars, starting with today, right, throughout this. We're going to study a Great Depression, a number of presidents, and all of these political movements as well. So we have so much to study in this unit. We need a framework with how to understand it then, right? So we need some basic checkpoints as to what we're looking for. Every time we study it, what kind of major theme does it connect to? That's where we're going to start and take our time with that today and understand what those checkpoints are so that we have a framework to understand all of this material we're going to add in. All right, so I've given you this at the top. So let's break it down together and start to come up with some questions we're going to have to answer between now and spring break. The good news about this unit is it ends at spring break, right? And if you're at spring break, then you're almost at the end of the year. If you're almost at the end of the year, then it's summer. And if it's almost summer, then it's almost your senior year. Except for Arya, who's going to be graduating, going to college, right? Things like that, right? Yeah, right? So really, it's all looking up. So don't be so down, right? All right, so let's start with this. An increasingly pluralistic United States. So the first thing we need to do is understand, what's that mean? What does pluralistic mean? If something's pluralistic, what does that mean? What's a synonym for that? Aiden, what do you think?
Like diverse, it has a lot of factors to it.
Absolutely, right? So change that word out for diversity, right? So the United States is growing increasingly diverse, right? So we want to know is why. Right, so there's our first question we have to answer throughout, right? So what caused the diversity or the pluralism? So we should constantly be looking for causes of that throughout this unit, right? So how the United States, and we've seen some of it already, but we're going to see a lot of it today, as you're going to see, because we're going to answer a lot of that question today when we look at our first topic of this unit. All right, so there's our first question, right? So we know the United States is going to be growing more diverse in its makeup, right? So we want to know why. All right, so an increasingly pluralistic United States faced profound domestic and international or global challenges. So there's two easy questions, right? So what were the major domestic challenges? Is another question we're going to have to answer. And then the same question comes out of global challenges, right? So what were the major global challenges, right? So if we have these immense challenges facing the country, domestically and globally, and what do we mean when we say domestic challenges? What's that mean, right? Elizabeth, what's that mean?
Like within the country.
Exactly, right? So here in the United States, right? So internal challenges we're facing. And remember, that's why we started in 1890, because the theory was, without Western lands, right, that we are going to have increasing tension here in the United States because there's not that safety valve of people just to release to the west and move west, right? So we want to know what those are. And then global challenges on the international level, and we already know what two of those are going to be when we look at this unit, World War I and World War II. Right? But there's others as well that we're going to see today. All right, so we're going to be constantly understanding what these were, what caused them, what were the effects of these, right? Maybe even comparing and contrasting them. All right, and then they will debate the proper degree of government activism. What's that mean? What's government activism? Yeah, Dave.
Like how much they're going to put regulations on the economy, on society, and
Yeah, how involved the government is in kind of economic policy and social policy, things like that, right? So in other words, if they're debating it, what do we know about the American people between 1890 and 1945? Right, Carson, what do you think?
They were very active, and they were very involved.
Some were, right? But if there's a debate, what does that mean about others?
that they don't want to.
Yeah, right? So this is kind of that the country is divided, right? So really what we want to look at is what government policies divide the country. Right? So we're going to look at that. So we know that there are going to be people calling for the government to change dramatically. And then ultimately, we want to figure out who wins the debate. Right? At the end of, by 1945, we want to figure out who wins this debate. Is the government far more active, far more involved by 1945? And if so, why? Right? Or is it kind of similar to what we just saw in the last unit, where they kind of stayed uninvolved? And if so, why? right? So this is a big theme that we're going to look at, right? And then finally, they sought to define its international role. All right, so let's think back, right? So this is where we often can pull back from things we've already learned. So what two events did we learn about first semester that really kind of shaped America's international role? So first off, what individual that's famous in American history first shaped America's international role? Does anybody think? Well, Monroe was second, right? You're absolutely right. So hold on to him, because we're going to come back to him. But who was first? Who really shaped kind of our role in the world? Claire, what do you think?
Christopher Columbus.
He's not really American, right? He's an Italian sailing for Spain. Carson, what do you think? Hamilton did, absolutely, but who did Hamilton work closely with that maybe carried a little more oomph in his time? Brendan, what do you think?
The good old George Washington.
Absolutely, right? So why would we say that for almost 100 years, Washington really kind of shaped America's role in the world? And why do we say that?
Because it's basically like, don't get involved with a whole bunch of stuff like with the French Revolution,
Good.
the XYZ affair.
Yeah, remember, he set that groundwork of kind of international neutrality, right? Right, trying to remain neutral, don't have treaties with foreign nations, just kind of trade with people and mind your own business. All right, and then about 30 years after Washington, James Monroe changed that slightly. What did we learn about Monroe? So Zane, you were going there.
With the Monroe Doctrine, basically protecting everybody in the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly, right? So where Monroe changes Washington a little bit by saying, we're going to protect the Western Hemisphere from European colonization, right? Trying to stand. But in the end of the day, he didn't do a whole lot with it. It was more of a statement than anything. So for the most part, the United States' international role has been pretty minimal, right? We didn't get involved in a lot of international affairs outside of the war with Mexico in the 1840s. It was pretty minimal. Kind of stayed out of the way. Followed Washington's neutrality proclamation here. All right, so if they're now seeking to define it, right, what we're going to look at is what major changes will occur to foreign policy. Because we just got done studying a whole semester where almost nothing changed of American foreign policy, right? Washington laid the groundwork, right? Monroe tweaked it, but didn't really do a whole lot to it, and that's about it. Well, we're going to talk more about foreign policy in this unit than we did all last semester, right? So we want to see, okay, how did this change? All right, so if we look at this then, right? So we have got a number of major kind of framework to look at this unit, right? So we're looking at social history, right? And what's going to create a far more diverse United States than it was prior to this time period, right? We're going to look at political history, right? Where we're looking at kind of the debate over what our government should look like and who wins that debate, right? And then we're going to look at foreign policy history, which is really a new category for us in this class, right? So in other words, where we've had some units that revolved around one question, we now have a unit that revolves around 5 or 6 questions here. So what we have to do is every time we study something, we got to figure out which of these does it fit under, right? What is it evidence for? Is it evidence of that kind of social history? Is it evidence of that political history? Is it evidence of that foreign policy history? Or is it multiple, as you're going to see in some of these cases? Does that make sense? So this is why I wanted to start here, because these next 2 units are challenging, but I think you'll also find them incredibly interesting. Because you're going to start to see the United States that we recognize a little bit more take shape, whereas I think much of the history we've studied so far is not really a country we recognize that well, right? And so you're going to start to see this thing come into shape. All right, so this is our job, right, is to kind of answer all of these different questions. Sound fair? Sound fair? I'm not feeling the energy from you guys yet, right? It's this beautiful foggy day, right? We should have energy. See, this is, growing up in Northern California, we had a morning like this. You know what you used to do in elementary school when you had a morning like this where it's foggy?
Snow day.
No, you just sprint into the big grass behind your school because it's like all of a sudden you just disappear. It was like the most amazing thing ever. You take joy in these things, right? So don't lose that joy right? So, I mean, we could just go run out into the fog, but instead we're going to study about American imperialism, right? All right, so here is where we're going to go in this unit, right? So here are our major topics that we're going to cover. So we're going to cover imperialism, right, which is where we'll start today and kind of expand into on Friday. We're going to study the idea of progressivism. We're going to define that and look at that, what that was. We're going to look at World War I, right, and mostly from an American point of view, right? We're going to look at the 1920s in America, which are a decade of kind of a lot of change that occurs in this country. And then we're going to look at the onset of the Great Depression and the creation of what becomes known as the New Deal, right, which will have massive impacts on our government. And then we're going to look at World War II, which is really going to wrap this up, and we're going to see an immense amount of change to American economics, to American social structures, to American politics, and American foreign policy. Right? So World War II is going to kind of bring all of those questions together, as we're going to see. So we have a lot to do, because you could really take any one of these topics, and the amount of time that we have to study all of them collectively, you could study one of these topics in that time and still not have enough time to cover everything. Right? So we've got our work cut out. Right? So we've got to be on it and locked in. Right? So today, we're going to start with that first topic, American imperialism. One of my personal favorites. And we're really just going to look at about 12 years of history today, from 1890 to 1902. And that's it, right, is what we're going to look at. So before we do anything, we need to define our terms. So you guys have probably heard this term before. In other classes, you may have even studied it. So we need to understand, go back to what it is. So what is imperialism? Mira, what's that mean?
It's when one country wants to take control and exploit the resources from another country.
Absolutely, right? So it's where one country looks to, in some way or means, control an outside kind of plot of land, outside of their natural borders and things like that, right? So we look at a textbook definition. It's the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies. All right, so there's lots of different ways to do this. So let's think of some ways to do this. So what are many different ways that you can imperialize, one nation can imperialize another? What's one, Zane?
Everything that Britain
It's true, but they did a lot of different ways of imperializing, right? So remember, North America was colonies, right? So they actually brought people here to colonize it, right? So that's one way, right, to create colonies. And Great Britain is the textbook imperialist nation. What other things did they do? Aiden, what's another thing they did?
Military conquest.
Absolutely, right? So they can use military to kind of suppress other nations. Samuel, what else could they do? Okay, good, yeah, right? Economic resources, right? So you can control economic resources in a nation, and that's a form of imperialism, right? You can make a country dependent upon you, right, for certain things, right? So that is a form of imperialism, right? What else?
You can yeet one city in India.
You can do what, I'm sorry?
You can yeet it, like finesse it, you can grab it.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, right? So all of these are examples, right? And you guys are exactly right. Europe has been imperializing the world far longer than the United States. But by the 1890s, the United States is going to decide to get into this game, right? Because you could argue that the United States was imperialist far before the 1890s. Why? What would be some examples of things we've studied to date that some would say, no, the United States has been an imperialist nation prior to this? Trevor, what do you think?
The constant movement westward of the Mediterranean.
Absolutely, right? So that is a form of imperialism, right? So over Native American lands and things like that. So it's not like they're total strangers to this concept. Where else could we see the United States been imperialist? What do you think, Samuel? Well, that happened after this, right? So we're looking at things that happened before 1890, right? Which you're right, don't worry, right? Sherry, what do you think?
Wars with Mexico.
Absolutely, right? Mexico is a classic example of possibly imperial. So some would argue that the United States was imperialist well before this. But we're going to see kind of a burst, because one of the things that some would argue makes those earlier actions in the United States is that the land was kind of continuous, right? That they didn't really move outside of the North American continent for anything. Well, all of a sudden in the 1890s, we're going to see the United States move well beyond the North American continent into vast amount of lands, right? And so we're just going to use a couple case studies today. But if we look at it, American imperialism on a map, right, during this time period, this is what it looks like. It's filled with all sorts of small little island chains in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, all the way to Asia, right? We're going to look at 4 areas today, right, that are symbolic of American imperialism in the 1890s. We're going to start with the island chains of Hawaii, right? Then we're going to move into the island of Cuba, right? And then we're going to kind of move all the way to the islands of the Philippines, and then ultimately talk about China, right? And so these are areas where the United States is going to become heavily involved between 1890 and 1902. So our job today is to understand why. What caused this? Because we have seen imperialist actions by the United States before, but it was always in North America. Right? It was always in the contiguous North American continent when we look at the western lands of the Native Americans, Mexico, places like that. So we're going to see what's going to cause them to all of a sudden move well across the Pacific, right, all the way to Asia in this time period. So we're going to look for causes. And then what you're going to do at the end of this thing is you're going to rank them. You're going to rank the causes at the end of this thing and say, okay, what's number 1? What's the main reason we did this? What's number 2? What's number 3? Okay? So let's put some of those causes out there first and foremost that you'll have to rank later on in class. So why by the 1890s would all of a sudden the United States see this burst of imperialism go forth? So let's start with social belief in controlling lesser peoples. Right? Why is this nothing new? What is this just a definition of? What do you think, Zane? Exactly, right? So social Darwinism, right? So this is kind of coursing through the United States at this point in time. So why might this be a ready-made cause for why the American people are ready to then expand outward? So why might something like social Darwinism, right, kind of lend itself to this activity? Claire, what do you think? Exactly. It's not a conquering of those people. It's not a destruction of those people. It's a help to those people, right? To advance them, to make them better, to make them more civilized, right? So remember we saw it with the assimilationists, what they were doing to Native Americans out in the Western Plains, right? We saw it with treatment towards immigrant labor in the United States. So now that's a ready-made kind of factor, right? That we have controlled, exerted control over Native Americans. We have this belief in social Darwinism, right? This idea that the fittest survive. So really, imperialism is a natural-made extension to that social ideology that courses through the United States at this time period. All right, so there's one possible cause, right, of this. All right, possible cause number 2. That this might actually be an attempt to stabilize domestic politics here at home and grow international power. All right, so let's start with that first one. Stabilize domestic politics. Well, why has domestic politics, from what we learned in our last unit, what's destabilized domestic politics? What sort of political issues were growing in the United States by the 1890s that we just got done studying? Samuel, what do you think? Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of people that were fed up with kind of the corruption of the government, right? Representative of those political machines of the 1890s. And what group emerged in the 1890s that we talked about at the end of last unit that show that kind of being fed up with it? How do we think? Exactly, right? So our populists, right? And who made up most of the populist movement? And who made it up?
Western farmers.
Exactly, right? That felt kind of undone by these powerful business monopolies. So in other words, class is what's dividing America, right? So how might going into other countries actually unite a divided America on class? Mira, what do you think?
It kind of gives you a sense of nationalism instead of class-based.
Absolutely. There's a group of Americans that believe that if there is internal tension at home, the best way to solve that is go fight somebody else. And then all of a sudden everyone rallies around, hey, we're all Americans, let's go fight some people. Right? And you forget about the internal tension at home, right? And so there is a movement, and one of the most famous people that abided by that theory is a guy named William Randolph Hearst. Do you know who William Randolph Hearst was? It's very familiar. All right, who was he?
Did he own the newspapers?
Yeah, he was one of the biggest publishers of American newspapers in this time period. right? Along with the guy he was competing against, a guy by the name of Joseph Pulitzer, who was these big publishers, right? So we're going to come back to that. All right. So now, on one hand, right, wars can unify a country, but on another hand, it can also grow international power. So there's this guy. This is Alfred Thayer Mahan. In 1890, he wrote a book titled The Influence Upon Sea Power Upon History. Right? He was the head of the U.S. Naval War College. Right? And he argued that if you militarily control the oceans, you are also an economic power around the world. Well, what country, and he draws on history to try to prove this point, what country that you guys already mentioned would he point to as an example of a country that controlled the oceans that became the economic power of the world? What do you think, Ethan?
England.
Exactly, right? So yeah, that was what the British did. They had the most dominant navy in the world for a long stretch of world history, right? And as a result, they had the most dominant economy of the world, right, by stretching out over this. So his argument is that if you grow military power around the world, you grow American economic power. Why would that be? Why would that argument work? Because some would say that that's what we do still today, that we use military power to protect American economic interests. Samuel would say that, obviously, from his comments already today, right? So Samuel, why would you say that? So why do people believe there's a direct correlation between expanding your military around the world and your economy being strong?
Oil.
Well, but, I mean, oil's not the only resource this is done for, right? Because oil is not what they're after in this time period. But what does a military do to protect an economy? If you believe in Mahan's theories. What do you think, Don?
Like you're scared to challenge it.
Absolutely, right? So you protect all of your shipping lanes. You protect access to resources. Oil is a modern one, right? Things like that. By growing a military power. So if you have strong world military presence, you then have strong internal economic systems. That's what Alfred Thayer Mahan believed, right? And there was a young Secretary of the Navy who loved this book by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, right? Who just ate up Mahan's theories. So in other words, some of this might be political in nature, right? You grow your military, and it solves two problems. It ends political division at home. It grows your economy abroad, right? And so some would argue that that is the issue. And why would Americans want to kind of grow their economy? What do we know about the economy of the late 1800s from what we just got done studying? Aiden, what do we know?
It kind of had a ridiculous boom with the industrialization, and it's just trying to keep growing and get that momentum.
Absolutely. It boomed, but what always accompanied that boom throughout the late 1800s? Elizabeth, what do you think?
There was a depression in 93.
Exactly, right? A bust. There's a depression every 20 years. 73, 93. There'll be another one in 1907, right? And so how can expanding into foreign countries hopefully solve that? Because why is there a depression every 20 years? If we're expanding the economy like crazy here at home, what caused those depressions, specifically in 73 and 93? What do we think?
Like overexpansion.
Exactly. What's that mean, overexpansion?
They try too much to reinvest their money back into the businesses and increase production, and then it ends up blowing up.
Well, yeah, if you increase production, what do you need to increase with it?
Markets.
Yeah, the market, right? And so if a domestic market can't keep up with that kind of production, how can imperialism solve that problem from an economist's point of view, right? What do you think, Samuel?
Introducing yourself to the world market and the international stage allows you to get access to resources and invest in economic.
Absolutely. We just start selling junk to foreign countries, right? And what better way to do that than to conquer them with our military and force them to buy our stuff, right? Is the kind of theory as well. All right, so we see kind of political and economic attempts, because that's really our last one, right? Economic search for markets and resources, right? So there's two things that we just talked about here. So one, the closing of the frontier caused many to worry that resources are going to dry up, right? It's all tapped out. We basically pulled everything out of the ground in the west. the continent's tapped out. So we've got to continually search for more resources around the world. But, like Samuel just said, and Aidan just said, because of those two massive depressions, also people saw expansion around the world as markets, right? As economic resources. So these are our three kind of menu of causes to look at, right? The social ideology of social Darwinism, right? The political need to unite Americans at home that are being divided on class after we saw from that industrial boom and the growing power of the populace in the 1890s, right? As well as the idea that you can boost your economy by having military power abroad. And then ultimately the economic, right, benefits of imperialism. More resources to pull from to continue to grow your economy, more markets to sell to avoid these major panics that happen every 20 years. And there will be two more, 1907, and then if you know much about history, the big one's coming in 1929, right, as well. So this is kind of our menu to choose from. So here's your job. So your job at the end of today is you're going to order these. What you think, your argument is going to be, this is the number one reason, right? This is the thing that's really driving what we see. This is the number two reason. This is the number three. And to do that, we're going to look at a couple case studies, right? So we're going to look at Hawaii, we're going to look at Cuba, we're going to look at the Philippines, and we're going to look at China, right? Is what we're going to look at and see which of these that it best fits. All right, so let's get started then with this thing. So our first area we're going to go to are the islands of Hawaii, right? And so to understand Hawaii is to understand a little bit of the history going back into the early 1800s. So by 1810, Hawaii was a unified kingdom, right? It was really a chain of warring islands prior to this, where the royal family kind of warred with each other, right? And in 1810, King Kamehameha will unite the islands into one kingdom, mostly by conquering his brother, who controlled other islands in this. And what he used to conquer them is he actually welcomed in early American traders. And why he welcomed them in is because what they brought were guns and ammunition that he then used to conquer his brother, who controlled some of the other islands in Hawaiian chains. So King Kamehameha unites all of the Hawaiian islands in 1810 under his rule, and they are a kingdom. And by the end of the 19th century, they are a kingdom that functions all on its own, right? And they've even signed some agreements with the United States by the end of the 1800s. Now, the big agreement that comes in is to allow American business interests to enter the islands of Hawaii. And the dominant business interests are sugar growers, right? As the Hawaiian Islands are the foremost place to grow sugar in the world at this point in time, right? And so most of these sugar plantations were American-owned. Most famous was owned by a guy named Sanford Dole, whose cousin later on planted some pineapples up the road in Oahu, and that's where we kind of know that name more often today, is from Dole pineapple, right? And so by 1875, these sugar interests were exempted from American tariffs. Why is that important? If you're an American growing sugar in a foreign country, why is tariff exemptions important to you? What do you think, Aiden?
Then you don't have to pay the added cost in order to get your sugar refined.
Absolutely, right? So you're doing great, right? And so as a result, they start to import large numbers of Asian workforces, mostly from Japan and China, into the Hawaiian Islands to work as low-level laborers on these plantations. So by the 1870s, these white plantation owners, these Asian workforces, are actually outnumbering native Hawaiians, right, population. That's what's going to kind of bring this whole thing to a head by the 1890s, right? Well, also, as a result of this kind of relationship of King Kamehameha's family over the years, right, his one of his sons, in 1887, signs an agreement with the United States military to give access to the harbor of Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu to American naval forces, right, in 1887. Right? So this is kind of the context of what you're about to see. So it's at this point where this thing comes to a head. So I'm going to show you a short film created by Native Hawaiians about what occurs next in this situation by the 1890s. So watch and see what happens. And we're going to talk about why this happens.
On January 16, 1893, the Hawaiian Kingdom was a fully functional nation. It was internationally recognized, it was a member of the family of nations, and was actively engaged in commerce and trade. It had over 90 consuls throughout the world with ambassadors and ministers assigned to them. This Hawaiian Kingdom, its independence, was being threatened by a few individuals calling themselves the Committee of Safety. These were traitors. And they conspired with the United States to try to get Hawaii annexed by the United States under the idea of a treaty, not a conquest, but by a voluntary treaty. Well, that's what sparked things to occur in 1893, January 17th. American troops were landed under the assumption that American lives were in jeopardy. They were really landed for the protection of these self-proclaimed individuals, calling themselves the Committee of Safety. The Committee of Safety was specifically comprised of 6 Hawaiian subjects who were not of the native blood, 1 German national, a British national, and 5 American citizens, for a total of 13 people. Well, they decided to commit the crime of treason by declaring that the provisional government exists and that the United States is going to recognize them. So what they did was they conspired with Minister Stevens, the ambassador assigned to the Hawaiian Islands. They had him land American troops to protect their proclamation that they're overthrowing the government. These individuals made a proclamation that says we are the provisional government now, and we are taking over the monarchical form of government, which is fully constitutional. And they did this with the backing of American troops there. Now, mind you, it's only 13 people that are doing this, but you have United States Naval Forces and Marines coming off the boats. With the American troops landing, which was in total violation of international law and Hawaiian Kingdom law because they had no consent, Lili Okalani was put in a very precarious situation. She was Hawaii's head of state at that time. For her to take out these traitors, which she could have easily done, she would run into the problem with the United States. She realized that Minister Stevens was going to go ahead and recognize this provisional government as being the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Well, what she needed to do was to ensure that that can't happen by a legal process. So what she did was she yielded her authority, her executive authority, not to the provisional government, but yielded to the United States government because they landed troops unlawfully. And what she asked was an investigation to be done to find out that American troops did land in violation of international law and treaties that Hawaii has with the United States. And she stated to restore herself to her constitutional position as the monarch. Now, that very same day, right after Lili Okalani issued that proclamation, Minister Stevens went ahead and recognized the provisional government. Now, that's what gave them the go-ahead to now travel to the United States. And on February 14th, individuals from this provisional government signed a treaty in Washington, and then it was submitted to the United States Senate for approval. Problem.
All right, so let's pause there real quick, right? All right, so what's happening in this mix by the 1890s, right, with this context that I just laid out, right? So what happens to the Kingdom of Hawaii's government in the 1890s that we just learned? Carson, what happens?
The U.S. government establishes the provisional government?
Absolutely, right? Headed by what's known as the Committee of Safety, right? Which is basically like 13 guys. 6 of them American sugar growers, right? Okay, now how could 13 guys overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii's government? What support did they have, right? What do you think, Aiden? Exactly, these Marines that were stationed at Pearl Harbor march in. So in other words, this is an armed overthrow of the native government of Hawaii under, at that point in time, the granddaughter of King Kamehameha, Queen Liliuokalani, right, who was the last native monarch of Hawaii. Right? Okay, so this is the point we get to. So what we want to understand is why. Right? So why would they do this to Liliuokalani and her government? Right? Okay, well, let's add some more context to that film then. So why did they do this? Well, here is the last native Hawaiian queen. Right? And at this point in time, she's starting to realize there's an issue on the islands. Right? There's kind of growing foreign influence on the islands. So in the 1890s, she passes a measure through the Hawaiian government that says that the only people that have the access to vote in Hawaiian politics are those of native Hawaiian blood. So why would she do that, you think? What's she trying to accomplish by doing that? Samuel, what do you think?
She's trying to make it so that like the plantation owners and all natives can't influence.
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? So with growing kind of foreign influence between the plantation owners, their immigrant workforces coming from Asia, this is a Hawaiian trying to kind of hold on to native power on the islands of Hawaii during this time period. Now, why would that offend these American sugar interests? Same way you think.
They no longer have a way to influence the policies in Hawaii.
Absolutely. Exactly, right? So since they can't influence these policies, we'll just make our own. Right? We'll make our own government using the United States military. Well, let's add some more context to it, right? Well, in 1890, Congress passed what's known as the McKinley Tariff. And the McKinley Tariff ended the Hawaiian tariff exemption that sugar growers had. Well, why is this a double gut punch now for these sugar interests, right? So what problem does this create for their business in this time period? Samuel, what do you think?
They are now actually paying tariffs to the United States.
Yeah, right? So in the islands, they lose political power, and now in the United States, they're losing economic power, right? Because basically their market now is being reduced because this tariff has been built up that now will raise the price of the sugar that they're going to try to sell to the American homeland, right? So what did we see at the end of that film? What does this provisional government try to rush through Washington, D.C. as a result? And what do they try to rush through?
They try to annex Hawaii for that way it's the same country, so there's no tariff.
Absolutely, right? So if they can become annexed by the United States, that tariff goes away. Right? So in other words, there's kind of two things working here by these sugar growers, right? So as a result, right, Sanford Dole and this committee of safety, they overthrow the Queen in 1893 with the help of the U.S. Marines stationed at Pearl Harbor. They rush that order of annexation into Washington, D.C. by February of 1893. The problem they run into is that there is a political switch. All of this was done under President Benjamin Harrison, but in March of 1893, Grover Cleveland comes in and he vetoes the annexation treaty, putting this whole thing on hold. Right? The problem is, though, that the Queen is still locked up in jail, and this committee of safety is still in control of Hawaii. Right? But the president doesn't believe this is a actual treaty. So we're going to see how Hawaii becomes a full member of the United States later on. All right, so but if we just look at this start to Hawaii's entrance into the United States sphere, right? Which of those three causes does this seem most representative of? What do we think? Does anybody think?
The economic,
Yeah, why?
because it was primarily because of traders who had more money.
Absolutely, right? So to kind of gain control of those resources and of the Hawaiian Islands, the rich kind of sugar plantations of the Hawaiian Islands, right? Because now outside of the United States, there's an economic detrimental effect to them, right, if they're not annexed in. So they engineered an overthrow of a sovereign government with the help of American to kind of maintain that economic dominance. Well, it's not the whole story, as you're going to see, though, because it got blocked for a little while. Right? And we'll talk about later how Hawaii does finally fully come in. All right, let's move along to our second one then, right? And that's going to be talking about the island of Cuba. And Cuba is going to be the center point of what becomes known as the Spanish-American War, fought in 1898 between the United States and Spain. So we're going to use a document to study this war, right? Which you have there in front of you, which is the Teller Amendment that was published in 1898, right? So I'm going to show you a little bit of historical context. So I'm going to show you another short clip here where we're going to provide some historical context to what happened in Cuba with the United States prior to the writing of this document that you have in front of you. So let's take a look and let's see what important historical context we should add from this film clip.
With the United States now extending from sea to shining sea, expansionists coveted the scraps of the Spanish Empire, the Philippines, the Pacific, and in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, a strategic island at the gateway of the Gulf of Mexico, and where Americans had $50 million invested in sugar. But with 300,000 soldiers in Cuba, Spain was determined to hold on to the island. To crush the insurgency and weaken support for the rebels, hundreds of thousands of Cubans were herded into concentration camps. Their plight became daily fodder for William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who beat the drums of war to build their newspaper empires.
What makes the enthusiasm for a war in Cuba almost unanimous in 1898 is that it offers a way for the United States to express both of its impulses. The impulse to make a statement to the world, we are an imperial power. And on the other hand, the opportunity to say, we are bringing our heritage of liberty and freedom and democracy to people who want it.
With war fever running high, all that was needed was a pretext. On February 15th, 1898, in Havana Harbor, an explosion destroyed an American battleship, the USS Maine, killing 266 men on board. Even though reports on the cause were conflicting, President William McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain.
All right, so we stopped there, right? So we've added some good historical context, and we'll come back to this with what happens after, right? So if we're looking at a document published in 1898, so what should we pick up just from that short film clip? What historical context prior to 1898 is going to precede this document? So what should we know? Come on. Carson, what do you think?
The U.S. had a lot of investments in Cuban sugar.
Yeah, specifically sugar once again, right? So here we have that kind of ringing a bell once again. So much like in the Hawaiian Islands, American business interests had massive investment in sugar plantations on the island of Cuba, making Cuba, again, something that maybe some are covetous to bring into the American fold. Why? Why is this similar then to Hawaii? Right? And why?
That aspect of economic interest in the region.
Absolutely, right? So to bring it in, and those sugar interests would obviously love to get rid of that McKinley tariff of 1890 that kind of taxes sugar, because Cuba now is far closer than the Hawaiian Islands to the American mainland. Seems like a natural kind of inclusion into the United States. But who sits in Cuba that's unwilling to kind of let it go at this point in time? Sherry, what do you think? Yeah, so they're still part of the old Spanish Empire, right? From when several hundred years ago when Spain had started conquering this. Remember, the island of Cuba was one of the first places the Spanish landed. And so they're still there with their troops. And what are they doing to the Cuban people that would start to become kind of noted by the American people in this time period? Aiden, what do you think?
They're putting them in concentration camps so that they can't grow more powerful and rise up against the Spanish.
Absolutely, right? So there's two things happening here, right? So if we look at this, what you just saw in that film, this is important historical context. Right? So the Cuban Revolution is years old by the time we get to 1898, mostly led by this guy, Jose Marti, right, who is trying to rid Spain from Cuba. And these revolts begin in the countryside, which is exactly where much of the sugar growing is happening. So to gain the attention of the American people, what these Cuban revolutionaries do by 1895, starting with Jose Marti, is they start to actually burn sugar plantations in the countryside. Well, why would the Americans first take note of that? Because what do we now know about those sugar plantations? What do you think, Pavan? Yeah, they're American-owned. They're American-invested. Right? And so this is getting the attention of the American people. Now, to try to squash this revolt is where the Spanish come in, and they begin to create what are known as kind of concentration camps, led by a general, Valiano Weyler, who starts to become labeled by American newspapers as the butcher. And why? Because what is the policy of how you're going to stop, right, people from joining the revolution? What are you going to do to them? Samuel, what do you think?
Murder them and round them.
Exactly, right? So you put them into these re-concentration camps, and these are images of Cuban people in these Spanish concentration camps, right? And so if you didn't know any better, you think they come from something later on in this unit we're going to study, and the concentration camps of Nazi Germany and Eastern Europe. Right? But this is what the Spanish were doing to the Cuban people. Right? And so who starts to bring this? So if the sugar plantations gain the attention of business interests, who starts to bring this to the attention of the American people? Same who? Yeah, exactly, right? It becomes known as yellow journalism. This very sensationalistic form of journalism. Mostly by William Randolph Hearst. And why? What's Hearst's motivation to do this? What's he trying to do here in the United States? Right, Sherry, what do you think?
He's trying to bring, like, the freedom that the U.S. has to Cuba.
Yeah, he believes in kind of this American democracy. What else is he trying to do? Carson, what do you think? Yeah, right? Because in wartime, right, people go and buy newspapers, right? Or they turn on, nowadays, their 24-hour news networks, or they flip on Twitter, whatever it is, right, nowadays. So back then it was newspapers. So why would he want to see the United States go to war? What's in it for him if the United States goes to war? Elizabeth, what do you think?
Headlines.
Exactly, and people buying his newspapers, right? So our spring musical here on campus is Newsies. That's the setting of that musical, because most of those newspapers were sold by orphan boys that lived on the streets in cities like New York and things like that you didn't have to pay much money to, so that William Randolph Hearst could make lots and lots of money by selling newspapers that were going to be bought in mass because we're at a war. So he wants a war. So he starts publishing all of this stuff. And in February of 1898, right, I'm going to skip that one for now, right? In February of 1898, he gets an even bigger gift for his newspapers. Because why? What happens that will then be used as kind of the preface for this war? Zane, what do you think? Absolutely, right? So in February of 1898, American President William McKinley sends the USS Maine, a U.S. battleship, into the battle or the harbor of Havana to kind of just keep a watch on what's going on here because there's lots of upheaval, and it mysteriously blows up, right, in February of 1898. Now, despite the fact that we're not really sure how it blew up, what do you think William Randolph Hearst will instantly publish that they actually showed you in that film clip? Aiden, what do you think? Exactly, right? With no evidence whatsoever, it becomes a rallying cry. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, is what William Randolph Hearst publishes in his newspapers. He wants a war, right? And so this is all the historical context of our document that we're looking at, right? So it's a lot of this kind of journalistic battle between Hearst and Pulitzer here at home. It's these American business interests and what's going on in the sugarcane. And then it's the fact that the Spanish are pretty brutal in their treatment of the Cuban people in this time period as well. All right, so with that in mind, let's now go back to our document and let's read this document. All right, so let's look at the Teller Amendment. And let's read it, and then we're going to answer our point of view and our purpose questions as well. We figure out kind of who wrote this document. All right, so let's start. All right, who's my volunteer to read the Teller Amendment here? Aiden, what do you got?
All right. Whereas the abhorrent conditions which have existed for more than 3 years in the island of Cuba.
All right, stop. Abhorrent conditions that have existed for more than 3 years in the island of Cuba. What are they referencing? So this is 1898. So what's been going on since 1895? Mira?
The Constitution.
Exactly, right? So the rounding up of Cuban revolutionaries into these reconcentration camps, right? So we see them directly referencing that context. Pick it up there, Aiden.
So near our own borders have shocked the moral sense of the people of the United States, which have been a disgrace to Christian civilization, culminating as they have in the destruction of a United States battleship with 266 of its officers and crew while on a friendly visit in the harbor of Havana, and can no longer be endured, as has been set forth by the President of the United States in his message to Congress of April 11, 1898, which upon the action of Congress was invited.
All right, stop there. All right, so two more pieces of context that we just saw in that film that he referenced, right? So why are Americans' moral senses shocked at the reconcentration camps? Who brought it to their attention that allowed us to be shocked and appalled at the treatment of rounding up people of native descent into concentration camps? Something the American people would never do, except for they did, right? Samuel, what do you think? Exactly, right? So he's referencing, right, that kind of the constant drumbeat of these newspapers who reported on it and reported on it and reported on it. And then ultimately, what did it culminate in? Why do we know for certain that the Spanish are a bunch of jerks by the spring of 1898? Why, Carson? Yeah, they blew up a battleship, which later history turned out they actually didn't do. It was most likely a blowing up of an engine inside, because modern forensics shows that it was probably an internal explosion, not an external explosion that downed the USS Maine. But that didn't matter at that time, right? They thought the Spanish had done it, right? Okay, so if we look at that first paragraph, what's the first purpose that we're gaining? Who's to blame for this growing conflict that's about to occur with a war between the United States and Spain? Elizabeth, whose fault is it? Yeah, they suck, right? It's all their fault. They're rounding up Cubans into concentration camps. They're blowing up American ships. We're just trying to do what we do and just be so good to everybody, right? So it's all their fault. All right, so let's finish it from there then, right? So, Aiden, go ahead and pick it up there. Therefore,
Resolved first, that the people of the island of Cuba are of right ought to be free and independent. Second, that it is the duty of the United States to demand, and the government of the United States does hereby demand, that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government in the island of Cuba and withdraw its land and naval forces from Cuba and Cuban waters. Third, that the President of the United States be, and he hereby is, directed and empowered to use the entire land and naval forces of the United States and to call into the actual service of the United States the militia of the several states to such extent as may be necessary to carry out these resolutions into effect. Fourth, that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for the pacification thereof, and asserts of its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people.
all right, so let's stop there, right? So let's add to our purpose here, right? So if we think, okay, we're going to war with Spain because they're a bunch of jerks, well, what is this document? What technically is this document in American history? So who wrote this document? What point of view does it represent? Think about how our government works and what this really is. Who wrote this? They mentioned it in there. They were asked to write this by the President of the United States. If we're listening closely to what Aiden read. Who wrote this? Carson, who wrote this?
Secretary of War.
Not the Secretary of War, no. Hey, Elizabeth.
It just says the government of the United States, so is it just the government?
Well, which part of the government?
Okay.
Right, Robbie? Yeah, Congress wrote this. Now why? Because what is this document? Right, Samuel, what is this? Yeah, so why does it have to be Congress? Exactly. By the Constitution, Congress is the only one that can declare war. This is a declaration of war, right? So the purpose of this document is to declare war. But they're giving reasoning, right? So we are going to war because the Spanish have brought this on, is what Congress is saying. Now, what else are they saying? They're also outlining our war aims. So what's the only thing, according to this document, we want out of this war with Spain in 1898? Oh, and what do you think? Yeah, we love freedom so much that we want the Cubans to bathe in that freedom. And once we free Cuba, what's it saying the United States is going to do once we free Cuba? And we think,
We're just going to mosey on that.
yeah, we're going to beat it out of here. We're good. We did our job. We rained freedom down on the people. We can now leave, knowing we've done our job as the American people. Right? Okay. Well, if we trust this document's actually not an imperialist document. Why? Say what do you think?
Because it doesn't talk about actually conquering and taking advantage of the it has good intent.
Yeah, it's almost anti-imperialist, right? We're freeing a foreign nation from imperialist controls of the Spanish. So if this document is true, well then it's not imperialist at all, right? So let's see what happens after this document then. So let's go back to our short little film clip here, right? And see what occurs following this declaration of war given by the Teller Amendment.
U.S. forces landed in the Philippines and Cuba. From Cuba came images of American heroics. Theodore Roosevelt, at the head of his Rough Riders, captured San Juan Hill and the American public's imagination. A splendid little war, Secretary of State John Hay called it. The Spanish-American War lasted a mere 13 weeks. When the U.S. Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet, Spain surrendered. The American army entered Santiago de Cuba as liberators, while the Cuban rebel army was forced to wait outside the city.
The story is told in America that the Cubans are a lot like us. They are trying to free themselves from an oppressive colonial power. As they're imagining they're like us, they're imagining them as white. But the Cuban allies turn out to be mostly black. And this is confounding and upsetting, because in their own society, Americans are saying things like whites are fit for liberty and self-rule, blacks are not.
The head of U.S. forces, General William Shafter, remarked, "These people are no more fit for self-government than gunpowder is for hell."
The final insult comes in December 1898, when representatives of the United States and of Spain sit down to negotiate the end of the war and the spoils of war. The people whose destinies will be determined, the Cubanos, the Puerto Ricanos, the Filipinos, none of them are invited to take part in these discussions.
The Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico were now under U.S. control.
All right, so if we look at just that, right? So on the surface, we have a document that says we're going to war because Spain sucks, and we just want people to be free. Well, what information did we hear from that clip? Maybe we should question the sincerity. Because I know this might come as a shock to many of you. Sometimes the government, especially when it comes to wars, doesn't tell the truth. I know, shocking, right? You guys are good people. I'm sorry to break the news to you in this fashion. Right? I know, it's okay. It's okay, right? Especially when wars are started by boats blowing up. We're going to see that trend happen about 4 more times this semester. That there's a trend of how we like to start our wars, talking about boats blowing up, right? As you'll see. All right, but anyways, I digress. So what information, just from that kind of clip of the context that came after this document, might question the sincerity of the purpose of this document, published by the American government, right? What do you think, Owen? Yeah, they got in there, and most Cubans are of mixed race, right, because they're mestizo culture. Many were former African laborers that were brought on the island as slaves to work the sugar plantations, and so there's this mixed race of people, right? And what do we know about the United States in the 1890s when it comes to people of mixed races? Samuel, what do you think? Exactly. It's not really accepted, right, at all, right? And so, as a result, what does it make Americans very resistant then to do for Cuba? Elizabeth, what do you think?
Well, the Americans don't think that they can rule themselves.
Exactly. To have self-rule, right? And so if we look at the context that comes after, we should really question the sincerity. Now, first, what they showed us was that the Spanish-American War was considered a splendid little war by the Secretary of State, John Hay. Why? What did they mention as to why he said, this is sweet. What a great little war. Right? Why? Pavin, why? Yeah, it lasted 13 weeks. Spain was so crippled at this point in their history that more American troops died of the flu than actually died of combat. Right? Because we were by no means a military juggernaut. In fact, there's a great story of when we actually landed on the island of Cuba, where ships took off from Tampa Bay, Florida to Cuba. Well, they had no way to actually land on the island. So they just started jumping into the ocean and swimming in, right? The soldiers did. Well, they wore wool uniforms in that day and age. I don't know if you've ever been to the Caribbean in June, right? Wool is not a good look as well as for swimming. So most of them had to take their uniforms off while they swam in. They were pushing horses just off the ship that would swim in, things like that. And so really what happened was, because they had to take their uniforms off, a bunch of naked guys walked onto the island of Cuba, right? Because we didn't have any actual way to militarily land, right? That's how warlike this whole thing was, right? It was kind of a silly little war, right? And so it's declared on April 25th of 1898. It ends on August 12th of 1898. Only 460 Americans die of combat. 5,200 die, however, of disease, because that's how unprepared the United States military was to actually fight in a major military conflict at this point in time. So at this time in history, the United States is by no means a military juggernaut compared to the other world powers of this time period, right? So with that then, right, they also created new heroes. The biggest hero that was created out of this war is a guy by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, who resigned his position as the Secretary of the Navy one day when he was drinking at a bar in San Antonio with a bunch of cowboys. And they said, you know what would be cool? If we created an outfit of all these cowboys that just got done fighting Indians out here in the West, and we take them to Cuba. And so that's what they did, right? They rode up a hill, San Juan Hill, where there was very little resistance by the Spanish. They took this picture, and Teddy Roosevelt became a hero as a result of the Spanish-American War. That's him right in the middle with the Rough Riders as well, right? And so there wasn't a whole lot of major military combat. But what it did do is it signaled a reunification of North and South, right? And so remember that this picture is a very famous picture of the outcome of the Spanish-American War. That you have an old Confederate general, an old Union general, right, who reunite in its effort to break Cuba from its shackles, right? So you see the little girl wearing the Cuban crown, right, has those shackles that are broken. Now what's the symbolism that Cuba is represented by a little girl that matches what we just heard about how they'll be treated by the United States afterwards? Maybe Carson?
That they have no idea how to.
Exactly, right? It really shows them as like this kind of incompetent person in distress that we have to kind of do everything for, right? Is the symbolism of it, right? So this is what happens after the Teller Amendment, right? And on top of that, the treaty that ended it, because if you're going to have a treaty to end a war, there's only one city in the world to do it in, is Paris, right, in 1898. So we're back to treaties of Paris. Well, what did we just learn? Who was not invited to negotiate the end of this war at this treaty ceremony? Anything, Zane?
Cubans, Filipinos, and people who were going to be affected by the actual treaty.
Absolutely, right? So the Cubans were not, and the Filipinos. Now, why does that also make us kind of suspect of that first document? Because they mention it in there, if this is a war to free Cuba, why are we fighting in the Philippines, which is some 3,000 miles away from Cuba? Right? Carson, what do you think? Exactly, right? So that should give us some kind of evidence to really not really trust this document, the Teller Amendment, at all. Right? So coming out of the Treaty of Paris was this. Cuba was indeed freed from Spanish rule. Spain also gave control of Puerto Rico and the island of Guam to the United States. And the American government bought the island chains of the Philippines for $20 million. So they paid $20 million now to control the Philippines as well. Right? So if we look at the Treaty of Paris, does this at all match the Teller Amendment? Why not? Why not? Aiden, why not?
Because it didn't leave him alone at all.
Yeah. Right? So we said we were just there to free Cuba. Were we just there to free Cuba? No, what did we get for our efforts here? Right? Samuel, what did we get? Absolutely, right? They all come into the American fold. Now, on top of that, something else that wasn't mentioned in the film is that Hawaii was officially annexed as well. Because we were fighting in the Philippines, we realized, you know what? You need a good base to launch an attack on the Philippines from. And Pearl Harbor is that base to launch an attack on Asia. So therefore, Hawaii is now officially annexed in 1898, where that provisional government that had locked up Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii was now annexed into the United States, right? Because the first shots of the Spanish-American War were actually fired by Commodore Admiral Dewey in the islands of the Philippines at Manila Bay, not in Havana, only 90 miles away from Florida, right? And so when we look at this, this gives us a lot of evidence to be suspect of the Teller Amendment. However, according to the Treaty of Paris, they did in fact free Cuba, right? Well, let's see how free Cuba was. So let's read now a second document, right? So this is the Platt Amendment, published 3 years after the Teller Amendment, right? So in other words, what do we know now has happened in between these two documents? Carson, what do we know? Exactly, right? The war has been fought. The United States controls all of this new territory from the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, right? And they have signed the Treaty of Paris as well, right? So all of that has occurred. All right, so point of view. So who most likely wrote this document? If it's another amendment, who wrote this? And this is also written by Congress, right? By the United States Congress. But what we're going to see is it has a very different purpose from the Teller Amendment. So let's read this one here, right? All right, so who's my volunteer to read the Platt Amendment? Aiden, who's going to take it away? You are Mr. I'm going to read documents related to the Spanish-American War. Take it away, my friend.
I will wear that badge with honor.
Good, you should.
All right. Shall define the future relations of the United States with Cuba substantially as follows. That the government of Cuba shall never enter into any treaty or other compact with any foreign power or powers which will impair or tend to impair the independence of Cuba, nor in any manner authorize or permit any foreign power or powers to obtain by colonization or for military or naval purposes or otherwise lodgmental and control over any portion of said island.
All right, stop there. What's that say? In our own words, what's it say? Oh, and what's it say?
You can't do anything with other countries.
Yeah, Cuba can't sign a treaty with another country. They can't let any other country have access to their island or anything like that, right? All right. Aiden, from there.
That the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence.
All right, so to make sure Cuba is independent, what can the United States do?
Tell them what to do.
Yeah, right? The only way to make sure they're independent is to take control of them. Right? All right, moving on. Aiden.
That to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba and to protect the people thereof, as well as for its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations at certain specified points to be agreed upon with the President of the United States.
All right, so what's the United States get on the island of Cuba?
Military
base. We still have it. It's called Guantanamo Bay, all right, today, right? So in other words, all right, so what is the purpose of this document? After the Spanish-American War, what's the purpose? Aiden, what's the United States trying to do here? What's Congress trying to do?
kind of control Cuba through democracy, so it's like, I control it, but like, we don't. Like, you're free, you just can't do anything that we tell you not to, and we get a whole bunch of privileges that no one else has.
Exactly, right? So Cuba is free, but yeah, ish is kind of the way to add that, right? But the United States can intervene whenever we want. Cuba can't sign a treaty with any other country but the United States. And oh yeah, we'll just have military on your island to make sure that you are free and independent, right? So in other words, couldn't we say that the purpose of this is to actually limit Cuban independence, right? Now, why would they do this, right? So why would, from what we just saw in that film clip, why would the United States look to limit Cuban independence? What does the United States think about the Cuban people from what we saw in that film clip? Aiden, what do you think?
That they can't rule themselves, and it also talks about how it's like for our security, Cuba is kind of it's a very strategic point to get into the Gulf of Mexico, so by having military stations there, they protect their water access.
Absolutely, right? It's a very self-serving document for the United States, right? And it does show that kind of racial sentiment of the time period where they didn't trust people of non-white races to rule themselves, is what they're saying in that. Okay, so with this in mind, right, does this at all match the purpose of the Teller Amendment? Why not? Because what was the purpose of the Teller Amendment we just identified then? Claire, what was the purpose?
Teller Amendment was free Cuba.
Mhm.
Cuba, and this is the exact one.
Yeah, exactly, right? So this one has no intention of freeing Cuba, right? Okay, so the Teller Amendment, right, was to free Cuba, and this is to control Cuba. All right, so which one do we trust then? So here we have historians. We have two documents that flank this war. One before the war, one after the war, right? And we have to decide which one is actually probably the truer history of the time period. Which one do we trust? Elizabeth, what do you think? Okay, why?
Because it shows that the U.S. actually had different intentions. The first one, they wanted to become Cuba for their own economic, racial gains.
Okay, good, right? So why might a document that actually takes place after a war actually show you the truer intentions of those people than the one before? Trevor, what do you think?
Because the power of Spain is outside of the U.S.
Absolutely, right? So now the United States actually has control of it, right? So now they can kind of do what they want, right? Well, why wouldn't they just be honest before the war? Zane, what do you think?
Because before the war, you can say, this is what we're going to do. It might not happen, but this is what we're going to try to do. Whereas after the war, you kind of have to say, well, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, no, we can do this, right? Absolutely. And why might documents before wars? Because we're going to study several wars coming up here. Right? So why might documents before war be all about freedom, democracy, independence, when documents after wars are less so? Mira, what do you think? Yeah. Exactly. We want those Cuban revolutionaries to fight with us, not against us, right? So if we come in and say, hey, we're just going to trade out with the Spanish, those Cubans are going to fight against you, not with you, right? But if you come in and say, hey, we are fighting for Cuban independence, right? You can then do a bait and switch after the war is over and say, JK, we're just going to take control of this ourselves, right, is what we're going to do. And that's really what the Platt Amendment is. Right? Oh yeah. So the Platt Amendment was actually a document that was inserted into the Cuban Constitution by the American Congress. Right? Is what it was. Right? And this is what it now said. All right. So when we look at Cuba then in the Spanish-American War, right? Now first off, this brings us to a number of things. So first, it brings us into some of our key questions then, right? So why now is the Spanish-American War, if we marked up one of our key questions is a growing diversity of this country. Pluralism. Well, why is the Spanish-American War a root cause of a growing pluralistic society? Who was brought in to the United States as a result of this war? What do you think, Carson? Yeah. Filipinos, Hawaiians, right? And all of the Asian workforce that was in the Hawaiian Islands as well, right? So if you want to understand kind of the pluralistic society, the Spanish-American War is the start, right? Right? When you look at the Puerto Ricans who will become kind of full-fledged citizens later on as well, the Cubans, the Filipinos, the Hawaiians, right? This is a good start to kind of the pluralism of the United States, right? Let me see. All right, so now let's bring it back to then the questions. So if we're going to use the Platt Amendment as our understanding of this kind of time period, right, and really the true intentions, well, which of those causes does it match that we talked about at the beginning of class, right? What do you think, Aiden?
I would say it supports mostly that second one to kind of like bring unity within the U.S. and also just increase international power.
Yeah, why?
With this one, you're getting a whole bunch of new territory. It's not really about the economics. That is a factor, but you're able to control strategic points, and it also kind of had that rallying call mentality in the U.S. where we had like that political cartoon with the
Good. Yeah, absolutely, right? So Aiden makes a good argument. If we're using that second point about kind of unifying a destabilized American political system at home, that's what Hearst was trying to do, right? It was this idea of kind of calling to war to unify people behind the cause of war. But then as we see after the war as well, right, we see that Cuba becomes a central military location in the United States to protect American economic interests right off our coast. As well, with Guantanamo Bay. But not only in Cuba, where else did we gain a key naval position to protect possible economic interests? Where else did we gain that, Carson? Yeah, Pearl Harbor. And then all the way to Manila Bay in the Philippines as well. So if we look at those are all modern American naval bases still today. Manila, Oahu, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, right? So they match that idea of growing your navy to expand your power around the world as well, right? So yeah, that's a good argument. Now, what else could we bring in maybe as a lesser part of this, right? What do you think, Owen?
The subduing lesser people.
Yeah, why?
Because they essentially said like the Cubans are lesser than us, so we kind of just have to take them over.
Absolutely, right? We see that with the Cubans were not invited to the Treaty of Paris. We basically just inserted what we wanted into their constitution because we viewed them as lesser peoples and that this would do them well. And what happened in Cuba after the war is basically what led a lot of that kind of social Darwinism to exist, because American military forces remain in Cuba until 1902. Right? They'll build roads and schools and hospitals. They reorganize the legal financial systems of the island of Cuba. Right? And then American investors come in. Havana becomes the Las Vegas of that time period. All of the wealthy elite on the East Coast would go and vacation in Havana because there was so much American investment into it. Right? So as a result, right, they say, this is us bringing civilization to you that you could not do for yourself. So that's that social Darwinist aspect that we just kind of took over from them because they were viewed as lesser peoples, right? Okay, so this is where we're going to pause it for today. So on Friday, you're going to read about a lot of this stuff, and then we're going to add 2 more countries that are going to have a massive impact here at home. Where we're going to look at the Philippines and China and the impact that that's going to have here on the American home front as well. All right, so hold on to your notes for Friday's class. Remember your first reading assignment.